Hi, I'm John Sundman. I'm author of the famous novels D.O.D.O, Cheap Complex Devices, The Pains, Acts of the Apostles. Enough about me. Let's talk about another novelist, Nicole Galland. I call her Nikki. She's the author of this one, Iago, A Clever Tale Imagining the Story of Othello from the Villain's Point of View. Her first book, The Fool's Tale. She's written several others, including Godiva, Revenge of the Rose, Crossed, A Story of the Crusades, and her big hot new seller is The Rise and Fall of D.O.D.O, co-written with cyberpunk legend Neal Stephenson. Nikki's a friend of mine. She lives here on Martha's Vineyard, where I reside also. She's a Martha's Vineyard native. I spoke with her, though, at her place in Jamaica Plain in Boston earlier this year, and I hope you'll find our conversation elucidating. More information in the field below, and please leave a comment. Thanks. Okay. So hello,
Hello.
Nikki. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, John?
Very good.
Good.
So I want to ask you today about your new book with Neal Stephenson, which I'll pull up here. You can hold up there.
Oh.
And just hold it. There we go. Rise and Fall of D.O.D.O. But you're going to be on a book tour soon, and you're going to have a million people asking you the same questions over and over again about your book.
That may be the case.
Right. So I'm not going to bore you too much, especially since we just spoke off camera. And I've got all that.
And I told you all my secrets.
You told me all your secrets because we're friends. So I am doing a bunch of interviews, basically on our current predicament. And by our current predicament, I mean...
You could mean so many things.
I mean the confluence of these trends. The climate crisis, the democracy crisis in the United States and around the world, the emergence of precision genetic engineering, and the emergence of really, really powerful algorithms and artificial intelligence, deep learning. So these are all trends, and there's probably another one or two, that any one of them by themselves could be like revolutionary for human species. People say we're on the cusp, or we're in the middle of the next big revolution, where if the Industrial Revolution was the last big one, and before that maybe the Neolithic Revolution when agriculture was introduced.
You skipped the printing press.
Well, the printing press was another, and the Enlightenment and all that, right? All that. I have a preoccupation with like the dystopian side of things. You know, maybe as my predilection as a novelist, you like to think about shit that could go wrong, because if everything goes right, you haven't got much of a compelling story, right? So. Good point. Anyway, so that's what I'm talking to people about, and so one of my hopes, one of my conjectures, is that art, including narrative art, is an important asset for humanity. So, in other words, it's not just an entertainment thing, but it's a vital thing for preserving civilization. Anyway, so these are things that go on in my head and that I talk to people about. So if you would like to talk about any of these topics, including maybe your book, one other point. So when I think about threats to civilization, anti-science and fundamentalism and magical thinking and fundamentalist religion are all I think antithetical to civilization. They're irreconcilable. And so I was kind of surprised when Neal Stephenson wrote a book that featured magic. Now, when I read the book, I saw that it's really going back to the Arthur C. Clarke, old saw.
There's a scientific explanation.
Right, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So this is really just a technology for manipulating local space-time that is not well understood except for by witches.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Right, but anyway, so it really is not a magical thinking book. But I was still kind of taken aback at first to say, what the heck is Neal doing writing about magic? Magic is the wrong direction.
I think his interest in magic is because of his interest in technology. And
right.
I mean, what he notices, there's something, the underlying premise of the book, the historical premise of the book is an accurate thing, which is that the more scientific thinking advanced, the less magical thinking seemed to have a significant place in culture and in understanding a worldview, that the two couldn't seem to exist at the same time. And he went from thinking that it was purely a philosophical tension to wondering if maybe there was something happening on another level that we weren't consciously aware of. And I think that was what spawned the thought for him. So it was a very Stevensonian origin.
Okay. Well, how about yourself? Coming from a non-scientific background, your background is, as I recall, I know you were a dramaturge. And
theater. Generally, theater is my
theater.
Dramaturg is like an editor for a play, sort of, or a production. And
you told me years ago that you were not very familiar with the whole genre of science fiction in general.
Yeah, I'm not. It's true. True.
And now you are one.
And now I am. Funny how that happens. I mean, there's certain, like, I love Arthur C. Clarke, I love Ursula Le Guin, but she's more fantasy than sci-fi. She may be, in fact, only fantasy.
Yeah.
And speculative fiction like 1984 and Aldous Huxley and Handmaid's Tale, I'm well read in that stuff, but as a genre, I veer more towards fantasy, and even that was when I was a kid.
Right.
I think after Tolkien's a hard act to follow. So once you're old enough to discover Tolkien, you're unlikely to. For me personally, Tolkien didn't make me want to go out and find other fantasy writers. Tolkien made me feel like, okay, done that.
Right. Well, but I read a lot of stuff, or tried to read stuff after, in that, orc, goblin, dwarf, sword, kind of. Genre, and they all felt like watered down Tolkien. Now, Game of Thrones may have been good enough to establish its own mark, but there was a lot of just watered down Tolkien.
Well, even Game of Thrones, which I really enjoy the HBO thing. I've never read the book. I didn't know about the books until the HBO came out, which I'm sort of embarrassed about, but it's true. I feel like he is riding on Tolkien's shoulders.
Yeah.
So, I'm not in any way denigrating the massive amount of work that he did, but the very idea that you could do that is something that, in terms of, as a novel or a series of novels, Tolkien started that.
Yeah. So when you look at yourself as a novelist, now you've got, 6 novels out or something?
Depends on how you count it, because there's one that was written under a pen name, and then there was the Mongoliad, which 7 of us co-wrote. But I guess six or 7. I guess 6.
In that neighborhood, you're not up to a few dozen, but you're definitely not a one novel.
Right.
Novelist. How do you think? What is the profession of novelist to you?
Storyteller. More than anything. Yeah. It's funny that you ask it that way, because there apparently in the more highbrow literary world at this moment in time, there's an argument about the role of a novelist and what's a real novelist and what's serious literary art and what isn't. And I had never thought about it, but I think that I'm not interested in doing the high literary art, even though I feel like I ought to want to, but I don't. Mostly I just want to tell a story and create a scenario, whether it's an alternative world or just another variation of this world, where people lose themselves in the story and want to hang out with the characters, even if they want to kill the characters. But I'm not being very articulate.
No, you are. You said a couple interesting things, actually.
Okay, hopefully you can edit the rest.
No. One is, to me, high novel versus, or highbrow versus lowbrow. I always There's a lot of bullshit posing going on.
I think there's definitely posing. The fact that the market listens to the posing is unfortunate, but
to me, it all just comes down to a matter of craft. Is the story well told? Is it well constructed? Do I get lost in the...
That's a big part of it,
Yeah.
but the story itself, to me, also matters. I'm reading a book right now that I love, and I'm really enjoying it, but I'm at the beginning of it, and it's very long, and I suspect that I may not make it all the way to the end, because I don't think there's much story. It's really just about, ooh, isn't this fun? Aren't these characters witty? And isn't it fun to,
Will you share with me and our viewers what the book is?
No, I don't want to get in trouble with anyone.
All right.
But what's funny is it's the third book in a row that I've read where the storytelling takes place on this kind of removed level.
Yeah.
So another book that I read like that I really enjoyed, that's much shorter, that I don't mind identifying, is Nell Zink, I think her name is, and the book is called Mislaid. And the premise of the story is sort of outrageous, and but she, in a very short period of time, she needs to cover about 10 or 15 years. So you don't see a lot of scenes. You get this sort of, and then once a week they would do blah, blah, blah. And eventually she felt, there's got to be a term for that. It's like an uber narrative.
Yeah.
Like everything is synopsized.
Yeah.
And then occasionally she'll pause and you actually get to live in a moment.
Right.
But then she goes back to synopsis. So I've been reading, it seems like all of a sudden that's how people are writing novels.
Right.
And that doesn't work for me.
Yeah. Well, there's all kinds of styles. There's one book that I wonder if that jackhammer outside is going to be picked up by a microphone here.
I'm sure it will.
But so there was a book called Hyperion by Dan Simmons, and I picked up a paperback copy for 25 cents at a library book sale, and it took me more than a year to read the book because the prose was so clunky that I just couldn't stand it. And some of the characters were just so unbelievable and cardboard that I just thought this is not worth wasting my time on. And yet the story had me hooked.
Really? That's worth something.
And this is high space opera. This is classic when people think of what is science fiction. Spaceships and
Cowboys in space,
a planet under attack, and alien forms of intelligence, and alien culture, and all kinds of mysterious ways that self-aware beings could relate to each other, that are not the way that any humans relate to each other that I'm aware of. I mean, there's lots of variety in human societies, but this guy was able to create societies that interacted in ways that are just totally foreign and weird, and make you think, well, why don't we react that way? And so it was really cool, And I mean, what would you do if you were a giant spaceship that was made out of wood? It was growing, and it was just, how would the world appear to you? So that was really cool, but I tried to read the sequel and I couldn't. It was just god awful. The actual prose, the story, I want to know what happens, but it's not worth. And I had a friend who told me about. She had at one point she was a copy editor for some publishing house in New York, and so she got this manuscript and she was told, just mark it up, just clean up the prose, and she did, and the author threw a gigantic fit, and turned out to be the same guy.
Oh wow, that's funny.
So she said she wasn't going to tell anybody, but when I told her about my reaction to this guy's writing, she said, "Oh yeah, I got a funny story for you." But so when you think about storytelling, is it something to which you ascribe any moral purpose? Does that ever enter your thoughts, or are you just trying to tell a story?
I don't. That's an interesting question. I'm not sure if I can answer that. I think that I want it to scratch a primitive itch in our lizard brain or something. I don't know if that is the same as a moral value. Do you mean moral in the sense of being instructive, or because moral is one of those slippery words that can mean a lot of different things.
I guess, do you think about a larger purpose to the work?
I do, and then I usually feel like I've failed to live up to that. Right. I think that's probably the most accurate And I think that the fiction, the literary fiction novelists like to feel that they are living up to that larger purpose. And I really envy their certainty that they have done so, even though I do not agree with them all the time that they have done so. I think there are a lot of novels that consider themselves lofty in a moral sense that just aren't.
Yeah.
But it must be nice to have that kind of self-confidence that you just believe that that's what you're doing.
Well, if you look at, take James Joyce.
I was thinking about him when you were talking about difficult prose, and then I thought, how could you copy edit James Joyce?
Well, there's a difference between difficult prose and just clunky bad writing.
Yes, no, I realize that,
but,
and obviously Joyce is a genius,
but did he? I really enjoyed Ulysses, for example. I'm a Joyce fan. However, there's lots of modern and certainly current postmodern novelists that I don't think are worth a dime. And I've written postmodern-y stuff myself that it amuses me, but it doesn't bother me when other people don't get amused by it. But it just kind of comes out that way. It's not that I set out to write a postmodern book. I just started writing, and that's where it went. But I had a few thoughts, but they've evaporated. But I know that you're a big fan of Shakespeare.
Yes.
Right. So
yes.
I don't get the impression that Shakespeare set out to do anything other than tell entertaining stories and write entertaining plays. But however, he has had an enormous effect on.
I think that in his case, and certainly not just him, but he's a really great example of it. He understood that telling a great story with great characters made us, both the characters and the people watching it, more human. And so to a certain degree, but not all of it. I mean, not all of his work has that kind of depth as well. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, not everything is... He only wrote one Hamlet.
Yeah.
He wrote a lot of very silly romantic comedies. But even those resonate. I feel like I'm not being very articulate.
No, you
for
are.
you.
You're doing fine. When I think you're being boring, I'll just edit it out. But I haven't had any of those spots yet.
So I think, I guess I'm not afraid I'm being boring. I just think I'm being sort of inarticulate. I think with Shakespeare, he understood that that to tell a good story in the way that he told it innately included things that are loftier than just the story.
Right.
And I think that probably everyone that thinks wants to do that, and I think very few of us attain it. But some of us believe we have attained it.
Right. Well, it's just a question of whether I think whether one aspires to art or not. I mean, I do. I like to think I'm aspiring to art. Whatever.
I think it depends on what your definition of art is then, and then you get into really murky territory. Right. I tend to find my relationship to what I do has changed over time. My first book I wrote because it possessed me, and I didn't have a choice. I wrote 18 hours a day. It was easier to write than to not write. It took effort to stop writing. I have not had that experience of any book since then. I get into the zone with each book, with one exception. 3 exceptions. But, I really get into the zone and I'm totally into it. But nothing has ever possessed me like the first one.
Well, that resonates entirely with my own experience. When I
there's nothing like your first time.
Acts of the Apollo, it was like Alien or something. This thing was like
exactly,
erupting out of my chest.
Yes, right.
And even
then it's
now,
hard
when you say get in the zone, when I talk to Betty, as you know, Betty's my wife. If it's really working, I say I gotta go. My brain's on fire. And because it doesn't always get on fire. Sometimes you just get the old Bunsen burner there, and you're trying to light it.
And nothing
morning,
happens.
Night.
I'm in the middle of that with this current book. I hope that and then there'll be moments like last week. There was a 48-hour period where I was completely clued in.
Yeah.
But I think so. A couple things happen if I try to write with a moral or to something loftier. It doesn't matter how it. My desire to do it a certain way and how it comes out are not necessarily related to each other. But the big problem is, no matter what turns out, how it's marketed, how the readers are told to experience it, has nothing to do with where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
And that I have found is it can be a destabilizing force in trying to think of myself as a certain way.
Do you find that how a book is marketed actually really affects how people perceive it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The strongest example for that there's two of my books in particular that leap out that way to me are Revenge of the Rose, which was my second novel,
which I read,
and Stepdog in a completely different way. With Stepdog was marketed as chick lit, even though the narrator is male.
Right.
If I had used a pen name that was non-gender specific or a male pen name, it could have been marketed more like a Nick Hornby novel.
Uh-huh.
And it would, I'm not saying that it's the same as Nick Hornby, but it's sort of in that style.
Yeah.
And it would have been marketed differently.
Yeah.
And it would have found a different readership.
Yeah.
HarperCollins might say, well, it wouldn't have been sold to as many people. I honestly don't know what the answer to that is, but it would have been different. What happened with Revenge of the Rose is, I remember coming out of the first PR, advanced PR meeting with my agent, and my agent said to me, "You're being punished for writing something that's really original." Because I saw it, a developmental editor that read it early on said, "This is a breakout novel. This is like you're really busting out of the genre of historical fiction. This is not historical fiction. This is like some sort of weird literary pastiche. Like it's just it's not like anything I've really read before." And then they marketed it like it was historical fiction, and the cover art suggested that it was historical romance.
Right.
And it wasn't either of those things really.
No.
And that affected, so people that picked it up believing that they would get what was written on the jacket copy got frustrated because that's not what was actually in the book.
Right.
And that's nobody's fault. That's just when you're dealing with a very large publishing house that kind of needs to do a certain amount of, fitting the template. That's what you end up with.
And if you write a book that has different facets to it, it's hard to pick out one facet to say this is what the book is.
Yes, right. But the marketing people have to do that. And they picked out the only facet that I was not really identified with, which is it happens to be set 800 years ago. Therefore, it's historical fiction.
Right.
Oh, and there's a love, there's like a weird sort of like love thing in it. Therefore, it's historical romance.
Right.
And it really isn't either.
Well, getting back to what is art
Mm-hmm.
and the definition of what is moral purpose of narrative art.
Mm-hmm.
I just so to make clear what my point of view is, I don't believe in polemical fiction. I don't believe in writing a book to give moral instruction. For example, like Ayn Rand, for example. Writes Atlas Shrugged to teach people about her, cockamamie worldviews. But even Uncle Tom's Cabin, right, which helped bring about the end of slavery, that was a book that was written to make a point.
Right.
It was a polemical book. That's not what I'm talking about, but or not anything that I aspire to. But I would love to be Shakespeare or something to have that touch people to really think about what is the nature of humanity.
Touching people, I think that's I don't get credit for this phrase, and I'm not even going to get the phrase right, but the purpose of art is to delight. I'm not even sure who said it.
Instruct to delight.
Is that it?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Instruct to delight. Well, delighting certainly is and that can take a lot of different forms. It can be the delight of moral insight, whether it's polemical or not. It can be the delight of, oh, look at that clever wordplay. It can be the delight of, look at the chemistry between those characters, or, the delight of, look at that clever person saving the day. Like, there's a lot of ways to be delighted. So I think the short answer to, like, what is art and what do I think of I hope I delight.
Yeah, good.
Even if that includes infuriating.
Good, and I don't have one answer. That's why I'm going around asking people, because I want to get their insights into these things. But this whole project of mine going around asking people these kinds of questions came about when I was talking with George Church. Now, George Church is a legendary molecular biologist who has a joint appointment at Harvard and MIT, and he's perennially on the short list for a Nobel Prize. Maybe he'll get one for CRISPR. He was one of the pioneers of CRISPR, but he's been real pioneers of all kinds of molecular biology since 1980 or so. And he's also a very flamboyant, larger-than-life guy, and he, he's been on the Colbert Report and Colbert Show a few times. He's the guy who wants to bring back the Heath Hen and Martha's Vineyard and bring back the woolly mammoth.
Okay, I know who you're talking about, yeah.
And as Colbert says, well, people accuse you of playing God, which is appropriate since you look the role, because George is like 6'6".
I think that I've seen, actually I may have seen that episode of Colbert.
So so George is an old friend of mine, and I interviewed him in his office about, 6 or 8 years ago, or maybe 10 years ago now. And then when I heard about CRISPR, I said, I have to talk to George again. This is going to be revolutionary. And so I went and talked to him for about an hour and a half. This is going on 2 years ago now. And I was saying the interesting thing to me about this technology as a destructive, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to think of all the potentially good things you could use CRISPR for. Like ending the climate crisis by sequestering oxygen, curing any kind of disease that you can think of, especially any genetic disease, eliminating hunger by producing, abundant, free, nutritious food, getting rid of all pollution. I mean, you can think of all these things you could do with this gene editing technology, but then if you think about all the bad things you can do, that's kind of shit I write novels about.
Right.
And I was thinking, but the interesting thing, as opposed to nuclear weapons, which can wipe out whole cities, the interesting thing about CRISPR is it's uncontrollable. You can't build a nuclear weapon unless you're a nation state, unless you have some kind of capability.
Right.
But I mean, they're teaching CRISPR in elementary schools now.
I know.
And so what is our defense against people who want to do bad things? Well, it has to be civilization. You have to make it so people don't want to do bad things.
Right.
You have to make it so people don't want to drive school buses into yards full of children.
Right.
So how does one do that? How does one inculcate the very idea of getting along in civilization? And then so that was one thing that prompted me to go on these series of conversations. And another observation is that when societies change very quickly, there seems to be this paradoxical backlash where people revert to fundamentalism. Nostalgia creeps up because the change is happening too fast. They want to make wherever they are great again. They want to make it great like it was in Muhammad's time, or great like it was during Jim Crow times in our country. And
well, that can happen on a milder and benign level, even like on the Vineyard. People want to make sure that there are nature preserves because there used to be a lot of nature.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying? So it doesn't have to always be, although some people think that even that is not a good attitude to have. But it's conservative, but that includes conservation.
Right. Well, there's a difference, I think, between being conservative and conserving things that have value versus being reactionary.
That's true.
Setting back the clock.
That is true. Right.
Especially when there are these attributes of fundamentalist movements wherever they pop up. They're always there's certain attributes that I remember this from my anthropology class 30 years ago, and you don't see it all around the world now. But they're always male dominated. They always require really strong gender roles with women in their place, the Handmaid's Tale, and so forth.
Oh yeah.
That's one attribute. Disbelief or non-conformity is punishable by death, and ostracism at the least, and death at the. There's a whole bunch of these things, and they pertain to any kind of reactionary movement, and they all are predicated on the idea that things used to be better during this imagined golden era.
Yes.
It's always we have to go back to the way things were.
Right.
It's not like we have to go forward to a new, better future that we can make together. It's all been figured out before. We have to go back to the way it was. And I think that's a scary and pernicious force.
Yes, yeah,
in,
I agree.
In 2017, more than it was in 1917
or 1017.
or 1017, just because of the interconnectedness of the world and the force multipliers that individuals or small groups can have. Anyway.
But at the same time, part of why they're doing that is because they are scared by the other option. They're scared of what happens if you go forward and are progressive in a world where everything is so interconnected. And
so is there a role then for average citizens or for artists or for scientists to...
That's a really big question to throw on me without having much time to think about it.
Well, I can tell you an acceptable answer. No. They know. It's like everybody's got... We're all just humans
I
here on
don't
Earth.
want that to be the answer.
Yeah.
I want the answer to be yes, but then I would need to be more specific. And off the cuff, I don't know what that would be. Yeah. It's very easy to fall into despair if you don't know how to answer that question. Yeah. And the only alternative to despair is to just make sure you're working on the question and the answer to it all the time. So I suspect that somewhere in the back of my mind, like a background, like a program running in the background, there's a part of me that's always grappling with that, but I have not, whatever it is, hasn't emerged as a thing that I could be conscious of, let alone articulate.
But you're doing the work if you're trying to create.
I guess I'm doing the work. The thing is, what is that term for things you can only see when you don't look at them directly?
Right, peripheral.
Peripheral, right. I feel like anything that I do that has to do with forward movement for my own life or for the art that I'm trying to create, it only exists like that. If I try and turn to look at it and say, I'm going to give this my full attention now and make sure that I march in that direction just evaporates. Yeah. I have to sort of stagger around, vaguely being aware that there's something over here and something over there. And it's not formed for me. I'm aware that these are issues that need to be addressed. And I would love to feel like I had done something that I could point to and go, here's the contribution that I have made on an artistic level, in the fact that there's this confluence of crazy things, and I would like them to be productive instead of causing a reactionary. Yeah. But I just don't know. I don't know what that is.
Right. Well, I think we all have a role to play, and I think that Mr. Sarno, Brother Sarno, was a teacher I had in 10th grade. Mm-hmm. And he was a teacher that kids like to make fun of. But he said something that always stuck with me. He said the poet's art and the interpreter's art are two different arts. And he was saying, a poet can write a great poem and really not know what it's about. It might be the person who reads the poem and explicates it who knows what it's about. The poet is just the vehicle that, happened to bring it into the world. Or it can be the case. So I think that there's truth in that.
You know what that reminds me of on an anecdotal level? It's not worthy of poetry, but two of my cousins and I were talking. They live on Long Island, and I don't get to see them very often. So I was visiting them shortly after my first book came out, and one of them had read The Fool's Tale, and the other one had not. So the one that had was describing a certain section of it to the one that had not. And she was technically, factually, getting it all wrong.
Yeah.
But she was so invested and so delighted, there's that word again, in her takeaway from the book.
Right.
That even though she was describing a book that I did not write, I didn't have the heart to say, well, actually, no, it wasn't like that. I just sort of let her run with it.
Yeah.
And I have no idea. I don't think that the other cousin would read it anyway, just because she's not a reader, not because she wouldn't. But that was fascinating to me to feel like I gave you something, and that's what you thought I gave you, even though that's not what I thought I gave you.
Did she catch the general gist of it, or was even that off?
It was literally a physical description that was off. Okay. It was two characters who become lovers, and it was that's the steamiest book that I wrote. It's got the most sex and the most sex. Yeah. And so there was there was a certain graphic, sounds not very classy, but there were definite physical descriptions of how each of them were as people,
right,
and how they connected to each other. And her description had no relationship, and in fact was frequently 180 degrees opposite.
Yeah.
But her description was worked for her.
Yeah.
Like she thought her description was great.
Right.
So even though I felt like you've totally missed the point. It wasn't worth,
Right.
you know.
It
was-
if she got the essence of their, well, even if she didn't, but,
Right.
but got the other.
And then the end of that book, I don't know if you've read it or
I
not,
did,
but the
I
end
did
of the
read it.
book,
Yeah.
people don't necessarily know actually what happens at the end of the book.
I think I got that.
Okay.
Right.
So,
I can
yeah.
tell you where I was when I read the.
Oh, really?
The final scene. Yeah, I was sitting in the roof parking lot by Brigham and Women's Hospital, waiting for either one of my kids or my wife to finish up an appointment that I was after going to go meet them for. I was just there flipping the last pages. You know,
Yeah.
So.
So I would be more, if someone was describing the end of the book in front of me, the end of the book,
Yeah.
and got it wrong, I would at least engage with a conversation with them about that's not really what I intended.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why you saw it that way?
Yeah.
But in this particular case, I just felt like it's not a disservice to the
Just
book, and
let
if
it-
that's the world she wants to live in, I'm just going to let her do that.
Do you remember the scene in Animal House where the Belushi character, Pluto, whatever his name is, he's saying, "What do you mean it's over? It's never over. Was it over when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor?" When it says the other saying, "Germans bombed Pearl Harbor," he says, "No, just let him go. Let him go."
Yeah. Yeah, it was a little bit like that.
Yeah. So, well, one of the things that struck me when I talked to George Church, I talked to Paul Berg, who was a Nobel Prize winner in molecular biology, did the first true genetic engineering experiments in the 1970s, taking a gene from the virus and sticking it into a bacterium.
Wow.
And so I was asking them insights into where fundamentalism and anti-science and magical thinking, where all that arises from. And I thought that their insights were pretty, well, in George's case, pretty naive and simplistic. And I thought, well, this is interesting because this guy is a world-class scientist in a million ways, but I don't think he's thinking very deeply about how people react to their world. Anyway, so I thought, well, then, this is something that artists pay attention to. Artists pay attention to how people, or novelists pay attention to how people talk one-on-one, and how misunderstandings happen, and how you can say one thing and mean another, and all that kind of stuff. And people who are working with laboratory, precision on things maybe don't think about those kinds of things.
I think that's probably true.
So there's all kinds of. Sorry, George, if you're watching this.
Well, we know, even in working on D.O.D.O, the way that Neal and I think about things, neither of us are the extreme, like, there's not that much of a disconnect, but the fact that he is a geek and I am like a theater person really informs what the things are that of them are the most interesting to each of us.
Yeah.
And they're different. I think that they supplement each other and complement each other very well for the book. But what each of us seemed really to latch onto as a thing of interest was very different based on how our brains are wired.
And your experiences.
Yeah. So it makes sense to me that a scientist would just be on a completely different wavelength than a poet or a novelist or a painter or a dancer.
Well, I'm taking this online course now out of University of South Queensland or something in Australia, and it's how to deal with climate change deniers, basically.
Oh,
so
really?
It's about climate science, but it's also about the phenomenon of people who do not accept climate science. And
wow, that's important.
It's an important, and this is the first course that I'm aware of, first in-depth. I know there are books on the subject, and I know there are magazine articles on the subject. When people look at the problem analytically, scientifically, to saying, okay, how do you deal with people who are, for example, members of a cult, to believe things that are manifestly false even in their own experience, right? If they believe that their cult leader can levitate off the ground, but they've never seen him levitate off the ground or whatever, how do you talk to people? And so it turns out that this is a subject that can be studied. When people believe things that are manifestly untrue, you can't just argue with them and say, well, that's not true, you idiot, right? There is a science to understanding what are their thought processes and how can you relate to them. And that's what I'm trying to get into, because I don't just want to be the
person spouting the
people
scientific
spouting,
information.
you're wrong, you're stupid, how could you believe that, you shithead. And although sometimes I feel like doing that, especially when people are not vaccinating their children and dooming some of them to horrible suffering because it's completely unnecessary. How do you, yelling at people is not going to solve the problem. Calling them stupid is not going to solve the problem.
Right.
So how do you do that? And I think that in itself is a question that needs to be looked at analytically. But
yeah.
But
it is, now that you say that, I would imagine that whatever you learn, however you learn to deprogram someone in a cult, must be useful for other people that just don't want to face reality.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I also think that art and literature also play a role, and that it's been asserted, and I'd like to believe, but I don't know if this has been proved, that people who read literary fiction are empirically better at empathy than people who don't.
That's interesting.
Because when you read fiction, as opposed to even going to a movie, you have to put yourself in the place of other people.
Yeah,
you have
that's
to put
an
yourself
interesting
in the place of the other characters.
Inside of their heads.
And so when you learn to become, I don't know, Anna Karenina or however, that just stretches parts of your brain.
That's so interesting. That's, well, you know what that makes me think of? I can't remember the names of any of the people involved, but there was a documentary filmmaker, I think it was an American documentary filmmaker, and he went to Germany and he did a documentary about a neo-Nazi movement, and particularly the leader of the neo-Nazi movement, who gave him unfettered access because he assumed that this guy was doing something that was, in support of his movement.
Goal, yeah.
And then he saw the finished product and had this awakening and realized that what he was doing was completely wrong, and escaped. And he had to escape. He essentially had to flee for his life from Germany. And now, if I'm not over-romanticizing the story, I think he lives in America or Canada. I'm not sure, but he spends his time reaching out to students and people that have been sucked into groups that are neo-Nazi-ish, telling them why they shouldn't be doing that.
Right.
And so for him, the art of the documentary was literally a mirror reflecting him back to himself and allowing him to see himself. It wasn't even empathy with another character. It was like him as a character realizing, I don't want to empathize with that person.
Right.
So that story, I read it in the New Yorker somewhere, and then eventually I got the book that he wrote, and he may have even written it with the documentary filmmaker. I can't remember that detail, but I can still see the book in my mind. That story just like set my brain on fire.
Yeah. I'm thinking of the Rabbie Burns poem "To a Louse." You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
A louse is still a louse, so it sits on the arse of a queen. But then he says, "Oh, would some power gifty gie us to see ourselves as others see us." So this guy did that.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Well, I'm running out of ideas here.
Okay. I really feel like I'm not being particularly there are times and places that I can just hold forth and gush.
Well, let me ask you, have you enjoyed this conversation?
I have enjoyed this conversation.
Well then.
Yeah.
Then we're all good.
Okay.
Right?
I just wish that I was a little more articulate and fruitful and
No, I've enjoyed everything you said.
Okay.
I haven't been bored or thought.
I'm sure that as soon as you leave, I'm going to think, I wish I had said that. I don't feel like I gave you good answers to the questions that you asked. I think if I had known that those would be the questions,
But
and
this
I
isn't
thought
a test,
about it.
Nikki. This is just
No,
two
I know,
people
but I
talking.
just would like to give
Yeah.
you something that is.
Well, then we can do it again, right?
Okay.
When you can always, if I post this edited interview
Mhm.
on YouTube, and you
Mhm.
say, "Well, I have something further I'd like to say on this topic or that
Okay.
topic," that's good because that's all more publicity for me,
Okay.
right?
All right.
Okay, so let's stop this interview here,
Okay.
and now, so that's a logical cut, but we're just
Okay.
going to let the tape roll.
Yep.
Okay, now you're going to say something nice about cheap, complex devices. Do you happen to have a copy of the book around?
Oh my God, I do, but I'm not entirely
You
sure
do.
where. Do
Okay.
you want me to go look?
Well, if you think you can find it in 2 seconds, otherwise.
I know. You know, when we moved in here, do you know that Billy had a heart attack?
Yeah.
So it happened while we were moving in here,
Yeah.
as a result of which 10 of our friends showed up and just grabbed things
And,
and threw them into boxes. And so we've unpacked, but we have not, even now, 9 months
Well-
later,
well,
we're not as organized as we should be.
as
so-
long as he's still with us.
He's still with us and he's doing well.
And he's doing well, so
And he's
that's
doing
the
well.
good thing.
Yes,
If
but
you can't find my
the
copy of
books
my
are-
book, that's a small.
Right,
Okay.
right. But
All
that's
right.
why. It's not
Okay.
because I don't value it. And what I've always done is that I have a shelf of books written by friends of mine.
Yep.
And I always try to keep those books together.
Yep.
But I don't think that that happened when
Okay.
the books finally got put into the shelves.
Okay, very good. So if you can think of anything good to say, we may just have this conversation be part of it.
I loved it. I loved cheap, complex devices. I loved the combination of, it was sly. It was like the humor of it was sly. It had so much soul to it, and it was so beautifully written, and it was smart, and it did all of it's such a tiny little book, and there's so much in there. Like you got in there as many original thoughts as Neal Stephenson can get into a much bigger book. I mean, it just blew me away how original a thinker you were and how succinct you were in the originality. And there was just so much heart to it.
I love you. Okay, we'll stop there.
Okay.